Tanaka joins the podcast today. Stephen is a well-known executive in Canada. He's actually the general manager for the Microsoft partner business at Microsoft Canada. Stephen has an incredible and impactful career journey from network specialist to senior consultant roles and also becoming the chief technology officer and general manager at Microsoft Canada. And above all, leading large orgs, making an impact to people, culture, and overall growth of the businesses that he represents. I've asked Stephen to come on today to talk to us a little bit about his leadership journey specifically, some of the lessons learned, and some of the teachings and learnings that he's had along the way. So without further ado, Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to connect with me.
Thank you, Rayshawn, for having me here, and that was quite an introduction.
Absolutely. Your profile speaks for itself, and I can't tell you how excited I am to have the conversation with you. And as usual, I always love to start off with the early days. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your career path, how things started off and eventually grew into the role that you're in today.
Yeah, I'll be dating myself, actually, Rayshawn. I say the early days, because for the early days for me, that was 30 years ago after coming out of school and starting at a company that a lot of people in Canada know today as Bell Mobility, but back then it wasn't as well known because cell phones weren't as pervasive as they are today. And so it was a great opportunity, kind of almost acting like a startup, quite honestly. A lot of the technology, I actually graduated in math and business and didn't think I would end up in technology, but my first job, I ended up in technology and just loved it and just had this voracious curiosity to just kind of learn everything. Back then, it was like even Windows was just kind of emerging. If you can think about that, it was really kind of DOS. Windows was just starting to emerge. Most things were mainframe. Most things were VAX, mini computers. I had to immerse myself in understanding, the old IBM 3270, and these might be terms that I'm really outdating myself and understanding the different flavors of Unix, all the way from HP and Sun Unix back then. And so that was my early days, my first job. My next job, I actually ended up into the Microsoft ecosystem, partly because Microsoft was starting to gain hold in the 90s with Windows, Windows 95. A lot of people remember that really probably was the mark for Microsoft and the popularity of Windows into a 32-bit operating system. And I decided to go work for a consulting company that really focused around Microsoft. They had a business around their back. Microsoft launched the MCSC. I was one of the first 50 people to get their MCSC way back in 1990, early 94. And so that kind of started my career into the Microsoft realm. And from there, I did a number of consulting jobs, Rayshawn. And then 1999, Microsoft came knocking on my door and said, why don't you come do consulting at Microsoft Consulting Services? And so that was my entry into Microsoft when you talk about the early days. And so that was my first role at Microsoft. And then from there, I've had, as you mentioned, a number of different roles since then. And we can talk about them. I've probably had about 10 different jobs in my coming up to 22 years at Microsoft now.
Some incredible growth there, Stephen. And I just love the context you provided just in terms of, starting off your career in the startup type of mentality, building a business, right? And just applying that entrepreneurial mindset just in terms of managing a business, customers, and then people that you represent, and then growing that, and then taking that consultative engagement, right? Just extending that towards acquiring business acumen and business skill in the market, and then having the opportunity to join Microsoft, right? Tremendous trajectory and growth opportunity, right? And you've held some, I see your versatility in the way you operate and run a business, and you've held some really versatile senior roles that allowed you to have this experience across multiple different facets of the people leadership business and the technology side of the world, right? I'm super curious, typically on this session, we talk about leadership growth and we talk about some of the key components that contribute towards the growth journey. So I'd be super curious to learn about, if you were to identify some of those key moments that may have shaped you or have put you in a position to stand out, to be in a position to get some of those roles or land some of those opportunities, what would you say those things would be?
Yeah, I'd say as soon as I came into going back to the early days of Microsoft, one of the things is I came in as doing consulting work. And one of the things back then, Microsoft probably wasn't as big as kind of somebody like Oracle and other companies back in 1999 in terms of relevance. We were strong on the desktop. We were just kind of building our strength in the server market. And one of the things that I think really helped is in that consulting role, I managed to do some high profile customers on behalf of Microsoft and be relevant in front of the CIOs. And because that actually happened back then, Rishan, what that actually did is other people noticed, and it gave me an opportunity where they said, hey, why don't you come over into sales? And so I did some horizontal moves, which allowed me to go into what we call at Microsoft our account team unit, which is really made up of our enterprise teams that are focused around specific accounts. So I got to experience selling and the accountability around selling and working with others around that. And then I from there branched over into our specialty team units, which are actually become more very focused, disciplined around specific solution scenarios. And then from there, Rishan, I got tapped on the shoulder this was back in 2007 to my first leadership role, which was actually the gentleman that I worked with earlier in consulting services. His name was Ron Withers. He's since passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease, but he truly was a mentor. And he had always said to me, you may be going over to sales, but I know you're going to come back to me in consulting. I'm going to come tap you on the shoulder one of these times. And he did do that in 2007, where Microsoft was going through a massive transformation on their consulting side, because consulting generally was more of like an accounting business. It was time and materials. What's the billable hours? What's kind of the brain on the stick that you get? And one of the things Microsoft went through back then, 14 years ago, was just transferring its consulting business to become more value-based. And so we really switched our business to become more about fixed fee and outcomes, pay a fixed price. Here's the outcomes we'll start to deliver. And that was a big cultural change for our consulting services. And quite honestly, we're leading edge there. A lot of consulting companies operate that way now, but it wasn't as pervasive 14 years ago when we first did that journey. And so I got the opportunity to help drive that culture on that first role because of somebody like Ron Withers, who was a really great leader and sponsored me into kind of taking that job and also being a good mentor and a good coach.
You talk a lot there about the leadership style and the leadership, I guess, strategy, philosophy, principles that really exposed you to grow, right? But you also, you talk a lot about your ability to sell and collaborate with the team and pretty much work with others and engage with others, right? And just demonstrate the quality that you were operating at with the people that you were engaging with for you to be recognized. In addition to that, you talk a lot about seeing the bigger picture, right? I picked that up as you're talking there, just in terms of the description of the roles that you were in, being able to see outside the lane that you were probably in and just think of the bigger picture, think of business transformation, and then, think of value-based selling as well, right? So there's a lot of components that go into you actually demonstrating the quality that you were able to operate at for you to be, and also good leadership, for you to be able to transition into some of those senior roles and carry that large responsibility. And so as we think about carrying the large responsibility, right, of course, people leadership is a key component of carrying a large responsibility, and your resume and your track record speaks for itself in that regard. But I'd love to tap into your definition of leadership, right? Just at a high level, and then we can take it a step deeper, but just tell me a little bit about your interpretation of leadership.
Look, ultimately, what is a leader doing? A leader is really helping to take a group of people or a group of individuals and really kind of internalize the goals and things that you're trying to achieve, and trying to help direct them and to achieve kind of those outcomes. Now, important aspect, you touched on some of these pieces, is what are the underlying kind of capabilities that help kind of achieve that goal? One of them is kind of creating, Microsoft, we have these three principles of creating clarity, generating energy, and delivering success. And so really creating clarity and demonstrating kind of the underlying value system on why we're doing that, I think is super important, on how you create that clarity and how you create that energy and that connection for the people to kind of bring them on that journey. I think that's super important, Rashawn. And then if you do the first two well, the delivering success will come out. The success will come if you can kind of really create the clarity and create the energy for the people, is what I believe.
Yeah, I firmly agree with you on that, right? Just that creating that harmony, understanding the team, creating that harmony, bringing people together to believe in a vision, and then create a growth model based on that, translate into success, and success being multiple components, right? One of those key components being repeating the impact that you're making, which is how I got connected with you, right? Just listening to the impact that you're making with the people representation that you're doing on a regular basis, by understanding the goals and the vision, and having an executable from that. I'd love to, I admire your leadership style, it's obvious, but I'd love to get your opinion on what are some of the misconceptions
Yeah,
of
I'd say
leadership.
one of the biggest misconceptions, Rishan, is you actually have to be a manager. That is
Right.
probably one of the number one misconceptions. What we just described, you can be an IC, a frontline person. It's just a matter of you kind of taking that control and helping direct that group of people to really create that clarity. You don't need to be a man. In fact, at Microsoft, it's so cross matrix that a number of people are playing this leadership role, and they aren't people in their organization where they're helping to guide them and bring them and achieve some of these goals that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, you said a very important thing there, right? And I think that's a very evident misconception on a regular basis, right? And so this takes me into my next question. It's an it's an excellent segue. Like, I'd love to get your opinion around, the teams that you represent, just carrying that message, being able to foster that growth for individual contributors that are not necessarily in a management role, but are
Yeah.
in a position to make an impact from a leadership perspective. How do you foster that, and how do you grow that skill set for them to be impactful leaders in the roles that they're in?
A lot of what I'll do, especially in coaching and one-on-ones, Rishan, is kind of also understand where somebody's value system is.
Right.
What is really important to them first, right? I think that's kind of really getting at the root of it is, and making them also through questioning, they may not even be aware of what their own value system actually is and what's really important to them. And so I think really ferreting that out and understanding that in terms of their core value system, because there's a different, what I find, Rashawn, is if you truly want to be a leader, you're really helping to elevate everybody else around you. It's not about, hey, I want to make sure I'm getting as many pats on the heads as possible. And
Right.
so I think that is a super important thing to kind of ferret out and to kind of understand people's value systems and their motivations behind them. And so, through questioning, I can see that, not always, but sometimes there's some people that are very much, no, I want it to be about me. And if it's about you, I just question, are you really want to be a leader? Because a leader really is about kind of elevating everybody else and making everybody else around them better.
I love that you take the patience and the application to understanding every individual. Like, I sense a theme across our entire conversation since the start, right? Just how you take the opportunity to really understand, assess the skill set, the quality, the level that the people that you represent operate at, so you can elevate that and make them better, right? There's some really good equitable value that comes out of just operating at that approach, right? I'd love to get your opinion, because you've obviously seen a lot of leaders during your time. You understand, you've clarified the misconceptions of leadership in there as well, right? I'd love to get your opinion on, what do you think are some of the typical mistakes new leaders or new managers that are in leadership roles make?
One mistake I do see, Rishan, is some leaders really think about the size of the org they're managing dictates how big of a leader they are. And so they
Wow.
really think about, how many people can I have under them, when that shouldn't be the case at all. Like, back to what we just talked about, it's not about the people that are reporting under your organization that dictate your leadership, right? And so the leadership impact that you can have by, those three principles that we just talked about, creating clarity, generating energy, which will deliver success, you can do that without having to have those people kind of reporting to you. And that's kind of one of the misconceptions that I see from some other places, not necessarily Microsoft, but I've seen that at places where it's like, I need the people reporting to me in order to lead them. And I think that's kind of false to think that way.
So well said. It's some leaders make the mistake of thinking that they need to be as big of a leader based on the organization that they represent. I love how you perfectly put that. What has been one of your biggest failures as a leader, Stephen?
Oh, that's I've got lots of those. Back to Ron Withers, who I took into my first leadership role. I then went into another pretty big job, which I competed for. It was to run a pretty big sales organization of 40 people. And I did that for over 5 years, running this big sales organization. One of the mistakes that I'd say I made, Rashawn, is I knew changes had to be made. and probably didn't think about back then. Just the maturity I had is around the change management aspect and managing that change management in more of a methodical way versus I would say I probably ripped the band-aid off too fast in certain areas. And that in itself, I think, had a lot of repercussions. So one of my biggest learnings, I think, that and from a mistake perspective, Rashawn, is really thinking carefully about the change management aspects and the plan and how you think through that, especially the communication and the buy-in and how you make sure that you really get that versus kind of, sometimes leaders come in, they feel like, hey, the change has to happen, it's not moving fast enough, I just got to kind of rip the band-aid off. And I would say that was a big learning for me, Rishan, is coming into a really large organization. I knew change had to happen, and I probably ripped the band-aid off too fast in the first year in my really big leadership role there.
Well, let me just start off by saying that I appreciate the vulnerability and the honesty there, right? Just in terms of your immediate reaction of the ton of failures that you've had along your journey, right? And if I interpret your response the right way, are you suggesting that you could have dealt with it a little bit more delicately, a little bit more?
Probably a little more methodically around kind of just the timing, communications on how. It's also at the time I would also say is there is, when you run sales organizations, there also is this constant pressure, right? Like when you're in a publicly traded company, the pressure to get to the quarterly results and get to the next quarter and have the supporting pipeline to support you there. That probably, with my experience now, and it's harder when it's your first really, really big sales job like that. There is this weighing of succumbing to the pressure and taking action versus doing it in kind of a methodical way.
I would imagine that the repercussion of not taking a fragile and delicate and methodical approach has a negative impact to the culture.
Definitely negative impact to the culture and potentially to the environment you're trying to create as you're trying to switch and create new skills for those people to thrive.
How do you or can you recover from that?
Yeah, so you always have to you kind of always have to have one eye on the short term, one eye on the long term. And one of the things that I would say, Rishan, is the diversity. Back then, I would say 2008, 2009, when I kind of took on that space, is you kind of thought of a seller almost as a cookie cutter templated of what you wanted versus I really needed to probably take back and think about the assets and the diversity of those assets on what I really needed to really contribute to what we needed both short term and longer term. And that's probably, back to another lesson, just kind of thinking through about what are those right capabilities that we need and thinking about it from a diverse lens about the diversity of capabilities that we need versus I think, when you first do some of these sales courses, you learn some of the methodologies, you start to pigeonhole people based on the things you're getting taught that this is what an ideal seller should look like.
More often than not, a lot of leaders suffer with that problem, and you said it bang on there, right? It's just being able to understand and assess and just learn the team, right? And then being able to recover and grow from that, and then applying a methodology to that as well is just the key to that growth and the positive culture impact. On the other side of that, a lot of lessons learned, Stephen. A lot of great components and nuggets that come out from the conversation, right? On the other side of that, like looking further, much further down the line from now, when the coil is burnt out on the journey and you were going to be remembered, people are going to talk about your leadership. What would you like to be remembered and known for as a leader?
Probably what I just said, Rishan, what I said about Ron Withers. I would hope that somebody would be saying the same thing about me down the road and the impact that Ron had on me early in career and becoming a leader that I am, which has resulted in me kind of paying it forward and thinking about building others. I would hope that would kind of happen when I'm long gone, Rishan. Somebody else is saying, if it's just one person that said, hey, Steve really helped me in my career to help me become a leader, which have resulted in them kind of paying it forward to the next generation.
I hear it all the time, and I have no doubt that will be the way you will be represented. I think that's an excellent place to leave it, Stephen. I can't tell you how grateful I am for you taking the time to have this conversation with me, but more importantly, sharing your journey, sharing your stories and your lessons learned as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rishan. I really appreciate you having me on your video podcast, and I really appreciate for everything that you do for the community, because the sharing that you're providing is actually being a force multiplier to everybody else out in the world. So thank you for what you do, Rishan.
That's super. I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much.